Hello, class. So, we're going to continue with the Seidman readings today, picking up on chapter 4. And we're going to move through chapter 4, 5, and 6. And then that will round out the Seidman readings for your first exam. So, I want to start off with a concept that comes to us from one of the founders of sociology, Emile Durkheim. Emile Durkheim took great pains in his career to demonstrate how sociology is a science no different than a natural science, for instance. And one of the things that he was looking at is what is sociology's unit of study? What is the thing that we can go out and do empirical research on? And he argued that sociology's subject matter is social facts or are social facts. Now, what are social facts? Well, social facts are very similar to the concept of social construction. There's a lot of overlap here. A social fact is something that is believed in. It can be real or imaginary. It's believed to be true by a given culture or society, and that people act on it and bring about consequences that are very much real and impact society. And so, one example of this that we can point to, a really big one, would be money. Money itself, particularly in the United States, has value by fiat, or in other words, it has value because we believe in it. There's nothing material backing it up anymore, ever since we switched to the greenback in the 20th century. So there's no gold to back it up or silver, nothing material whatsoever. One way to illustrate this even further with money is that the amount of copper it takes to make a penny is actually worth more than the penny itself. So we've depreciated the value of copper uh, just to so we'll have a coin that's actually not worth very much. Now, why are we talking about this in a sexuality class? Because just like money, identity itself is a social fact, the very concept of identity. And however you think about identity, those identities are dependent on your historical moment, your cultural background. It depends on any number of social organizations or social groups that you're a part of and how they've influenced you to think about yourself and understand yourself. And so identity itself, the thing we're focusing on in this class, except in terms of sexuality, uh, is itself a social fact. So sexuality is a social fact that touches on material reality, such as the existence of genitals and behaviors that we actually engage in, but it only has meaning within certain social contexts. For instance, a culture that values it in terms of identity. There's any number of things that we do that we don't necessarily think of as impacting our identity, such as our diet. We don't think of ourselves in terms of, I'm a fast foodie versus a sit down restaurant foodie, or I mean, these I'm just making things up, obviously, but these are not ways that we divvy up identity in our society and our culture. So, at this point in time, though, even though sexuality as an identity, as a concept, was invented rather recently, I mean, in terms of the scope of human history, it was the end of the 19th century that we end up seeing this concept really developing. But at this point in our history in the West, it's become a core sense of how we think about ourselves, a core sense of how we understand ourselves and each other. And we have built up elaborate social communication systems, a number of symbols in terms of linking the symbols for gender, linking male and male and female and female, or any other number of combinations. The rainbow flag would be another example. Um, Simply the fashion and what degree of fashion you're in. Queer Eye for the Straight Guy ended up illustrating that in terms of the level of importance put on fashion in straight male culture versus gay male culture, for instance. So, excuse me, as you can probably tell, I'm a little under the weather. Um, Now, one of the issues here is that oftentimes we think in terms of dichotomies or we think in terms of a binary. So you're either X or you're Y, and there's nothing in between. Now, as we'll be talking about later on, there have been some headway made in the earlier part of the 20th century in terms of thinking about sexual identity on a spectrum, particularly coming from Alfred Kinsey. Um, but the idea that we're still talking about things in terms of opposites is still very much present. And so, culturally speaking, Americans tend to think of being gay as being like the opposite of being straight, and vice versa. In terms of gender, we talk about men and women as being opposite sexes. It's this oppositional thinking within the binary that ends up causing issues where it emphasizes differences over similarities. And there's typically far more similarities than there are differences. Now, in terms of coming out, in terms of identity, in terms of sexuality, this is a big difference for someone who identifies as straight versus someone who identifies as gay or lesbian, or pansexual, or omnisexual, or any number of other non-straight identities. And so, in particular, the coming out process is different. Straight people come out constantly. They're constantly talking about their attraction to someone that identifies them as straight, talking about their relationships in gendered terms that identifies them as straight. And so the coming out process for straight people is constant, ongoing, and is kind of worked into the fabric of day-to-day life. However, the coming out process for someone who is not straight is fraught with danger. As we see many LGBTQIA youths are homeless because they came out to their parents and were kicked out of their homes. There's still a high degree of discrimination. Now, sexual minority groups have more acceptance today than in the past, but that's a false equivalency. If you compare today with the past, it always looks like it's getting better. But what you want to do is compare minority groups with the majority group and see if there's that same level of acceptance and that same level of affirmation. So, as if a straight person is able to go and talk about their attraction to people openly, and that's considered acceptable within certain social contexts, as long as it doesn't become, sexual harassment, obviously, or anything along those lines, we would expect that if there were true equality, that somebody who was not straight would be able to also openly talk about their sexual attractions and desires without it being considered odd or strange or something even worthy of note. Um, and so the coming out process for people who are not straight is actually a very dangerous experience. Now, as we're going to see, that there's some debate among historians and people who deal with the history of sexuality in terms of when sexuality as a concept really developed. And when we start talking about the major historians, we'll be getting into that. Um, but generally speaking, uh, the 1890s is when heterosexuality and homosexuality are considered to be invented. Now, why the 1890s? Now, this is also a part of how this identity becomes socially constructed. It starts in the 1890s because that's when the first giant scientific journals published on heterosexual and homosexual. However, as we'll see, that's privileging scientific journals. And politically, we can look at German Penal Code, and particularly paragraph 175, which outlawed being gay in Germany and was used to lock up gay and lesbian people during the Holocaust and put them in the concentration camps. And so that was like the pink triangle is what would be worn. Like Jews were forced to wear the golden star of David. Gay and lesbian people were forced to wear a pink triangle to identify them. Now, the really sad thing about this is that when the Allied forces ended up liberating concentration camps, they ended up taking the people with the pink triangle and putting them back into prison. The reason being is that they considered them to be truly criminals, whereas the other people were being attacked for who they were as people. But of course, I'm sure you're thinking, well, wait a minute. Weren't gay and lesbian people being attacked for the same reason? Yes. But there was no law against being Jewish, for instance, whereas there was a law against being gay or lesbian. Um, and so that's one tragic part of the story of the liberation of concentration camps. Not everybody was liberated. Now, in the 19th century, in the West, sexual impulses were understood as impulses to procreation. We talked about this a little bit in the last video in terms of Freud. The object of sexual desire did not matter as much as the sexual desire itself. And so scientists, in trying to understand homosexuality, this term that they invented, um, ended up thinking about it in terms of transgenderism instead of sexuality. And so gay men were thought of as being men with who are really women inside. And lesbian women were seen as women who are really men inside. Um, and so they understood sexuality through gender, which is a confusion that we still have to this day. Um, for instance, you may have heard somebody refer to gaydar. This idea that some people think that they can just tell somebody's sexuality by looking at them or by talking with them for a short period of time, and they just know, right? Well, what are people really reading? Because when you're talking about that, you're talking about a social reading. You're not really talking about sexuality. You're not talking about their sexual desires or sexual behaviors. You're not following them into the bedroom to see what they do sexually. um, what are you really reading? You're reading gender performances. And so we can see how this confusion between gender and sexuality that starts in the 19th century continues to this very day, where people still confuse gender and sexuality and think, for instance, that if a man is feminine, he must be gay, and if a woman is masculine, she must be lesbian. And that's simply not the case whatsoever. There are plenty of straight men who are feminine in their gender performances, and there are plenty of straight women who are masculine in their gender performances. And so when you hear somebody talking about gaydar, what they really should call it is genderdar or something like that. It has nothing to do with sexuality. But again, the confirmation bias, the times when people are right, they end up remembering, and the times that they've been wrong, they dismiss as anomalies. That's confirmation bias. You're looking for what you expect to find. So, now, there is a video that I posted for the first week that talks about heterosexuals as being the first perverts. And for those of you who've not watched the video yet, I strongly recommend you do. When heterosexuality was first invented as a concept, it was actually thought of as being a perversion. It was thought of as being a kind of mental illness. These are people who want to have sexual encounters, but not for procreative reasons. And so these would be people that we would today call straight, who, for instance, engage in oral or anal sex. They would be considered perverted because there was no possibility of procreation. Now, this also then carries over to other groups of people. For instance, say a straight menopausal woman who is no longer capable of reproducing. Um, if she desired sexual contact, as older women do and older men do too, grandma and grandpa don't stop having sex. It would be considered perverted at that point in history in the 1900s, or the 1800s, 19th century, because it was considered non-procreative. Now, this is one of the reasons why it's so important that Freud's contribution to the discussion in understanding sex as being connected with pleasure and not procreation. It opens up the possibility for all kinds of new sexual identities, as well as normalizing people who engage in sexual behavior with one another without any plans to procreate. Now, in the early 20th century, so early 1900s, we end up seeing that gender roles begin to change, creating a kind of crisis in gender, or crisis in masculinity specifically. We're talking about the 1920s. And in the 1920s, a trend revved up that started in the late 19th century, but it sped up in the 1920s, and then the process continued and then sped up again in the 1950s. And that was that more and more men were moving into office buildings, working for companies and corporations. And suddenly, social skills became important for men to develop in a way that they never were before. Social skills and having social skills was actually thought of as feminine traits. So, in this sense now, men had always defined themselves by their occupations. And so, if they had an occupation where they were having to do heavy lifting and they were having to really rely on the strength of their bodies, that was what was used to describe masculinity and what was understood as being the ideal of masculinity. When you move it into an office building, though, and physical strength doesn't really matter in an office building. I mean, unless you're having to lift huge boxes of paper or something. And we've got tools to do that. We don't need our physical strength. So, in this sense, then, masculinity goes into a state of crisis that, in terms of how to define itself, since physical strength was no longer relevant. And so, as a response, masculinity incorporated homophobia, something that it had not really focused on before then. So, for instance, a masculine man who's heterosexual or who's straight, in by our definition today, the terms get difficult when you start jumping around in history and talking about it. Um, would not necessarily have any issue with someone who was gay or lesbian by how we understand that today. But after the 1920s, since gender and masculinity had to be redefined away from the occupations, we end up seeing that hatred towards people who were homosexual ended up becoming a ingrained part of the American definition of masculinity. Oh, and as we see, the more ambiguous gender roles have become, historically speaking, the more important sexual identity has become across history. So this binary thinking, and particularly when it becomes oppositional, the opposite. So what are you doing? You're not just saying you're different. You're saying you're opposite. So to be X is to not be Y, and vice versa. That automatically sets up a kind of antagonistic sort of way of thinking about one another. And we can also we can see this in terms of sexuality. We can see this in terms of gender, as I've already mentioned. So we can look to research on masculinity and how young men define their notion of masculinity. And so studies of high school boys and college-age men reveal that masculinity is tied up with a sense of comfort with violence, also with a sense of entitlement to sex, um, misogyny, homophobia. Now, this is not masculinity as a whole. These are particular aspects of masculinity. And when these aspects of masculinity are emphasized, encouraged, and put on display, this is what we in sociology refer to as toxic masculinity. It's not that masculinity as a whole is toxic, it's that certain aspects are. So, the studies of the high school boys and college age men found that oftentimes fear of being thought of as gay is used as a measure of social control. And in parties where toxic masculinity is ratcheted up, it is common for women who have been drinking to be raped, sexually assaulted, oftentimes gang raped. And if a young man says, I'm not going to be a part of this, I'm going to call the police. What you're doing is a crime. It is immoral. I mean, all the kinds of reactions you would hope someone would have in a situation like that is all brushed away with the single question, what's wrong with you? Are you gay? And so this becomes a way of manipulating men into acting on those toxic aspects of masculinity by other men. Now, as I've already mentioned, uh, non-straight groups are becoming more normative in American society. And as they become more normative, straight people are working to try to create non-homophobic ways of talking about and thinking about their sexuality, but still drawing a distinction from themselves and people who are not straight. And so it's really interesting to watch because in a way, if there were no homophobia whatsoever, there would be no need for someone who is straight to work out a non-homophobic way of talking about identity. Um, there, why would you be afraid of someone thinking you might be homosexual then? All right, moving on. Let's start looking at political movements. So, there are sexual hierarchies. And what's meant by sexual hierarchy? It's a question of privilege and who ends up being privileged, who ends up needing to worry about discrimination. Um, and sexual politics are particularly designed to challenge these sexual hierarchies. Now, this goes back to earlier research by social psychologist Irving Goffman. Now, Goffman talks about stigma. He writes a whole book on it, as a matter of fact. It's a short book, but it's a powerful book. I recommend everyone read it. It's kind of the classic statement of how stigma works in societies. And he made a distinction between discredited and discreditable identities. So discredited are identities that have already been stigmatized, whatever the stigma may be, whatever the mark against you might be that lowers your status within society, that's already known, and so your status has already been lowered by having the stigma ascribed to you. Discreditable identities are people where if they there are certain aspects of their identity that would be stigmatized if that were to be found out. But since it's not immediately obvious, then they are not discredited, but they have the potential of becoming discredited. Goffman goes on to say that we all have something in our identities, in our backgrounds, in who we are that could be stigmatized by the broader cultures that we live in. And it's kind of his way of saying, um, uh, not to judge others because you can just as easily be judged as well. So, and we see that even within heterosexuality, sexual expression is governed by social forces. So, for instance, someone who's straight can still be sexually stigmatized if they're non-monogamous. Say they are in polyamorous relationships, or they prefer sadomasochistic sex, for instance. These are all things that are still possible to discredit the even straight identities in terms of sexual stigma. And this can result in serious social sanctions, ridicule, loss of family, loss of job, loss of a home. So, being heterosexual, and this is really the definition of heteronormativity and what we sociologists mean when we talk about heteronormativity. Heterosexuality is thought to follow a particular script. You have courtship between a man and a woman, leading ultimately to marriage, then to children. You're expected to follow monogamy and to have romance in the relationship. Now, I will tell you that this definition of heterosexuality doesn't develop until the 20th century. Um, it's it's largely influenced actually by sitcoms from the 1950s. Stephanie Kuntz wrote a landmark book called The Way We Never Were, where she looks at these kinds of myths about relationships in the past versus the present and finds that there's really not much difference. I mean, people are people. It's just the difference would be how we think about ourselves, how we think about others, and then how we act on those thoughts. So few live up to the standard. And even people who consider themselves monogamous will oftentimes have multiple sexual partners in their past. And so the only thing that separates out the multiple sexual partners is time. So, in that sense, it's more serial monogamy. So, you're monogamous in the moment, but not fully, absolutely monogamous. Um, and so heteronormativity and the expectation of heteronormativity as an ideal that is difficult for most people to live up to ends up producing deviant sexual identities that are either discredited or discreditable. Now, Seidman originally wrote the book Social Construction of Sexuality. We're using a more up-to-date copy, but he originally wrote it before the landmark Supreme Court case of Oberfeld v. Hodges. That was in June of 2015. And the book claims that marriage equality is still illegal in most states. That is not true anymore. Marriage equality is the law of the land now in all 50 states and by the Supreme Court's judgment in Oberfeld v. Hodges. But that doesn't mean that you have equality across sexual identities. And we see that many in queer communities still face housing discrimination, discrimination in terms of healthcare, shaming, social ridicule, even physical assaults. As I mentioned in the last video, particularly African American trans women are targeted and hunted in this country and killed, murdered because of who they are. We see educational discrimination and a high degree of social isolation. And so, in this sense, it's important to not come to the conclusion that just because marriage equality is now the law of the land, that we have arrived and we have equality across sexual identities. That's simply not true. That's not the case. We still have a long way to go for that to be the case. And we still see there's a sizable minority. They are a minority now in America, but still a sizable minority who believe that anyone who is not heterosexual is immoral, engaging in an unnatural acts. Now, that word unnatural always struck me because I think if something can occur in nature and does occur in nature, and we see the behavior like same-sex sexual behaviors among other species, how can something like that be described as unnatural? It doesn't make sense. It's almost like people don't know what the word unnatural means. But anyways, that's my little aside. We still see current debates turning on religious organizations, oriented around religious organizations, and they're arguing that their freedom of religion, the right to freedom of religion, also gives them a right to discriminate against people based on sexual and gender identities. And that is something that is still working its way out in American politics. Now, the notion of homosexual politics can really only be possible, obviously, after the formation of the identity itself. Now, while same-sex sexual behavior, of course, has existed as long as there have been uh, uh, people, and well, as I already said, other animals as well. Um, but the identity itself had to be defined and a political community formed for you to have something like, say, the homophile movement really organizing and getting off the ground. Now, from 1890s to 1920s, with the invention of homosexuality as a concept, as an identity, homosexuality became much more visible and discussed and talked about in broader American politics and culture. A common term for people who are gay and lesbian, and this goes back to how scientists basically ascribed transgender identities onto gay and lesbian people because they thought that the sexual impulse was ultimately always coming from the impulse to procreate, and therefore that they were what the scientists called gender inverts. Now, that term today is not used, obviously, and is actually offensive because again, it's confusing gender and sexuality. Now, in terms of the formation of the first gay communities in America, we want to look to the time period just following World War II. So the generation that fought in World War II um, were in homosocial environments. All right. So what does that mean? Homosocial does not mean homosexual. Homosocial means that you're in an environment where there is only one sex. So, since the military was only men during World War II, the men who entered the military were entering a homosocial organization. The same is the case for, say, college fraternities as homosocial organizations. Now, in these homosocial environments, and we can see this oftentimes with like boarding schools that are just for boys or just for girls. The idea, the thought is that if you have a homosocial environment, that you're not going to have people having sex. Well, that's laughably wrong. Homosocial environments do not stop sex whatsoever. As we can see with the concept of situational homosexuality, for instance, it's been studied greatly in prisons, where men who otherwise think of themselves as straight will have sex with other men while they're in prison. And then go back to having sex with women when they get out of prison. Um, and so homosocial environments do not mean no sex is occurring, of course. Some people still think that, though. All right. Um, Now, many of the men who went abroad ended up being exposed to same sex sexual behaviors and realized that it was something that they had always wanted. It was something that they had desired, but it was something that their society had not given them um, a legitimate avenue to express. And then here they are in World War II, and it becomes possible to express these desires that they had otherwise been repressing. So many, when they came back from World War II, did not want to go back into the closet, so to speak, if we can use a neologism to talk about that, and ended up moving to some big cities like Miami and San Francisco, New York, and creating the first gay communities in the United States. We also see that this is when organization in the homophile movement really increased. And so the homophile movement predates World War II, but you see this really strong organizational body developing out of the gay communities that were founded following World War II. Now, because of this, many, and because of the thought of this being of gay and lesbian people being immoral and unnatural and yada yada yada. In the 1950s and 60s, the government, from the national level government to state governments to local governments, cracked down on anyone who was even thought to be possibly homosexual. Lives were ruined. People would have their pictures and their addresses, and their other personal information published in newspapers if they were arrested for being gay or lesbian. And we see the formation in the 1950s of two groups that were part of the homophile movement: the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis. The Mattachine Society was developed first. It was developed in 1951, and was initially intended to represent all people who are gay or lesbian. However, it was mostly white gay men who had leadership positions, set the agenda, decided what the Mattachine Society was going to do. And many people of color, and many gay women, um, felt like their issues were not taken seriously. And so, in this sense, uh, they felt the need to break off and develop their own organization. Now, the Daughters of Bilitis was developed a few years later, 1955. It was established, and it was largely for middle class white women who were gay. Um, and they ended up emphasizing a very heteronormative understanding of femininity. And at the time, you saw a divide between middle class white expressions of being lesbians and working class expressions, and then expressions of people of color in the working class and middle class, as being different as well, because of obviously the high degree of segregation, of racial segregation. So, the Daughters of Bilitis, become a member, you had to wear makeup and wear dresses and be feminine. And so you still see the homophile movement ended up morphing, I should say. It wasn't really an end so much as an evolution. And this evolution in America occurs in starting June 28th, 1969, with the Stonewall uprisings in the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village, New York. Now, all of you, I hope, have watched the documentary on the Stonewall uprising. I posted two that discuss it. And this is considered the birth of gay liberation. So this was the second incarnation for the fight for sexual equality. Was gay liberation. Gay liberation was much more out in front. The homophile movement was more like, please stop burning our businesses and hunting us and killing us and brutalizing us with police. Um, Gay liberationism, though, was about getting off the couch and getting in the streets. It was about fighting back. It was when the first gay pride marches were first organized. The first one being in 1970 in Greenwich Village, following the heels of the Stonewall Uprising in the summer of '69. And gay liberationism directly challenged heterosexism, heteronormativity, homophobia, and understood homophobia as being detrimental to heterosexuals as well. Like we were discussing just a moment ago, the aspects of toxic masculinity, that homophobia is used to encourage in men who otherwise wouldn't engage in those kinds of behaviors. But it also ends up changing the expression of emotionality between people of the same sex, particularly men. So, for instance, because of fear of being thought of as being gay, men no longer really use love language with one another. If you were to look at letters between men prior to the 1920s, you would think that they were romantic partners. They express their love for one another, their longing for each other, their wanting to be together. And you can even see it in young boys when they're talking about their best friends. They use a lot of this kind of love language. But as they're ridiculed and stigmatized, and they're taught homophobia, you end up seeing men cutting off parts of the potential emotional expression simply because of a fear of being thought of as gay. So, this is what gay liberationism, these are some of the things gay liberationism points out as being detrimental to homophobia, being detrimental to straight people as well. Now, we also see that, as I've already said, lesbians ended up during this time period really being on the outs. The Daughters of Bilitis never really grew that large. I think at most they had just a handful of people. It began with 8 people total, that's who founded it. Um, And we end up seeing that, particularly after Betty Friedan published her landmark expression of second wave liberal feminism, known as the feminine mystique, she ended up arguing that feminists should reject contributions made by lesbian women. And because lesbian women, in her words, ended up muddying the waters politically for women in general, because it wasn't just about gender, it was about sexuality too. And she dubbed, in the feminine mystique, she dubbed lesbian women as the quote unquote lavender menace. So we end up seeing that lesbian women were on the outs with feminist groups, the groups that focused on sexuality, such as uh, the Mattachine Society and the homophile movement, and even in gay liberation. Gay liberation was begun with the help of trans people, the help of lesbians, the help of people of color of all different genders and sexual orientation. And yet, once the organization of gay liberation started being developed, once again, we see middle class and higher white men taking the reins and being in charge. And oftentimes, again, lesbian women felt like their issues were not being discussed and not being taken seriously. But then they were not being taken seriously by feminist groups either, because they were the lavender menace. And so you end up seeing the creation of lesbian feminism in the 1970s. And so this was a group that would speak to the intersections of gender and sexuality. Now, what ends up happening with all this political and social organization and community organization, we see in the 1970s some headway is made as some cities, so on the local level, passed gay rights bills. 1980s, though, is often looked at as a social and political backlash to the 60s and 70s. And so we see a lot of social activism being turned down, and not a lot still going on in the 1980s. This was the Reagan Thatcherite years, where it became even more dangerous then to come out than it had been, say, in the 70s. I mean, in the 70s, you ended up having people like David Bowie and a lot of rock musicians being very open with playing with their gender performances. And that also gets toned down. It doesn't stop, but it gets toned down in the 80s. And during the 80s, people ended up focusing much more on reform than just outright resistance. So instead of changing instead of, uprooting and replacing larger social systems and institutions, they focused more on reforming the ones that already existed. Um, 1990s, we see then the gay rights movement coming from gay liberationism. By the 1990s, you start to get queer theory developing in academia, though you can date queer theory much further back. Its foundation really is with Michel Foucault. And so you can date back the intellectual roots of queer theory back to the 1960s. But it was the 1990s when this ends up becoming much more of a focus. And so gay social rights and political rights movements in general, be they in turn in the vein of gay liberationism or be they in the vein of, say, queer nation and queer politics, ends up becoming far more inclusive, far more about the intersectionality. And this was largely due to the far Christian right backlash against the gay rights movements. So the inclusivity becomes a defining feature of queer theory and queer movements, where you try to be as inclusive as possible. That's also why the LGBTQIA keeps getting longer. And it's debated about which letters go in and is it getting too unwieldy. Some have suggested using GSM, gender sexual minorities, as a replacement. There's some issues with that in terms of taking a minoritizing view. We'll talk about that later on, though. So, what's going on currently in the 21st century? Well, three developments are being focused on. The first one is further community building. So, building interconnections, addressing the social isolation that many people who are otherwise would be a part of a queer community oftentimes face. Focus on full social equality. So, for instance, the recent Supreme Court decision that made it illegal to fire somebody for not being straight, that would be what they're talking about in terms of trying to achieve this full social equality, is trying to rid our nation of discrimination against people based on gender and sexuality, and the emergence of more queer politics. So, queer theory has moved into a central kind of discourse in academia, and especially in sociology. As I mentioned in the last video, feminism, particularly third and fourth wave feminism, and queer theory are the leading social theories in terms of sexuality from a sociological perspective. So, in this sense, queer theory becomes very central. However, queer theory was always intended to be about marginalized identities or people on the margins of what was considered normative discourse. And so, in trying to bring about more queer politics, what is meant by that is trying to keep queer theory queer, keep it about the marginalized voices, make it more and more inclusive, focus more and more on the intersections. We can see that with the gay rights parades in Gay Pride Month this past June, um, uh, placing Black Lives Matter front and center as an example of the intersections. All right. There is a focus on the diversity in queer communities because queer communities are also divided in terms of sexuality versus identity and sexual identity and gender identity. It's divided in terms of race, it's divided in terms of economic class, um, and it's divided in terms of ableism or your citizenship status. All of these kinds of things also impact gay and lesbian communities. Anything that impacts society at large impacts people in general. All right. So let's go back a little bit in this story of the politics. And I want to talk for a moment about bipolitics or the politics of bisexuality. And this is a movement against monosexism. The idea of monosexism is the prejudiced belief that somebody is truly must be straight or truly must be gay and there's no other options. And so bipolitics is about challenging that. Now, there's a few ways to think about bisexuality, and in the 1970s, bisexuality actually became in vogue, largely because of a lot of pop cultural icons like David Bowie, for instance, as I've already mentioned. For gay liberationists at the time, bisexuality was something that they theoretically subscribed to, and they thought that most people were born bisexual and then have propensities in one direction or another that society then encourages them to focus in on that. However, when it came to the reality of it, bisexual people ended up being stigmatized by both straight communities and gay and lesbian communities. Oftentimes, with the accusations in both that from straight communities that bisexual people were going to cause disease or something along these lines, or in gay and lesbian communities that they're somehow being tricked and they're sexual tourists just touring gay and lesbian culture. And so, since bisexuals were being pushed out and ignored and held at arm's length by both groups, you end up seeing bipolitics emerging to challenge that dichotomous thinking. And that, yes, there are some people who find others attractive regardless of their sex or gender. So, between the 1980s and 90s, you see the first formations of bisexual interest groups. And there's a couple of ways to think about bisexuality. The first one is the one that most people think about, attracted to both genders. Well, what about those people who are bisexual, who are not just attracted to men or women, but are also attracted to people who are intersex, who are attracted to trans men and trans women as well? who truly are attracted to a wide array of other human beings. Well, that's the second way to understand bisexuality, attracted to people regardless of their gender. And so it's this way of finding the erotic as being independent of social categorization in terms of gender and sexuality. Oftentimes, people who understand their sexual expression in this way will not, at this point in time in the 21st century, will not identify as bisexual. They'll identify as pansexual or omnisexual, which both are very similar terms. They mean similar things. And now, bipolitics is also critical of gay and lesbian groups for biphobia. And so they argue, straight communities will express at times homophobia. They'll also express biphobia, but then gay and lesbian groups will also express biphobia at times. And so this is the main one of the biggest critiques here. All right. Moving on, chapter 6. So the last chapter we're going to be discussing, and the last chapter you'll be tested on in the first exam for the Seidman readings. Remember that the queer theory textbook has key terms and concepts that are pulled out for you, and they even tell you what page in the textbook you'll find those key terms and concepts. And most of the questions from that textbook, from the queer theory textbook, will be coming from those key terms and concepts and major debates. So make sure to look at that, and you'll be responsible for the first 2 chapters in that textbook. So, moving on, Seidman, chapter 6. As I've already mentioned, and as Seidman has mentioned already in the readings, many cultures do not define sexuality as an identity. This is largely coming from Anglo-American cultures. Now, many years ago at this point in time, President Ahmadinejad, the president of Iran, not the current president, a former president of Iran, made the argument that Ahmadinejad, I knew it would come back to me. He made the statement there are no homosexuals in Iran, and became a global laughingstock because of it. Because, of course, there are same-sex sexual behaviors between people in Iran. That's true across the board and among humanity. But let's think about what he could have meant by this. I mean, I can't read his mind, so I don't know that this is exactly what he meant or he had this level of understanding. But Middle Eastern cultures will oftentimes not define the same-sex behavior that occurs as being homosexual or being gay or lesbian. It's understood in completely different cultural terms. For instance, a common practice and a place that predates Islam is the hammam. Now, the hammam is basically like a bathhouse, but it's also where men will go to sometimes they go just to steam and relax in a hot tub. Many go to have sex with other men, but it's not looked at as being homosexual or gay. It's looked at as just hanging out with fellow men, like this fraternal camaraderie. And so, again, this is about how a culture constructs the notion of identity and what identity means according to different cultures. We also see new gender and sexual expressions developing. I mean, chapter 6 is about the revolt against sexual identity. And this is a part of what Michel Foucault ended up arguing in his work as well. He says he argues that we need to transcend or get beyond the very concept of sexual identity to end up really just seeing the humanity in everyone, regardless of these notions of identity or sexual orientations or gender orientations. So, for instance, we end up seeing identities like metrosexual as something that's developing. Now, is this about sexuality? Is it about gender? Is it just a consumer marketing ploy to get men to paint our nails and wear makeup? Um, yes, to all. It's all the above. Um, Marketing firms realized that they were denying themselves, especially in the beauty industry and cosmetics, um, denying themselves half the population by not trying to market to men as well. And so it's partly a consumer identity created by marketing, but it's more than that too, because the concept of metrosexual could only have occurred within a particular cultural context in a particular historical moment. And so it's not like marketers could have developed the concept of metrosexual for the cosmetic industry back in the 1950s. It simply wouldn't have flown back then. So we end up seeing that it's about sexuality. Oftentimes, these are straight men who consume gay and lesbian culture and are not threatened by people who maybe might think that they're gay. Uh, they will go to gay bars, but it's a redefinition of masculinity that incorporates things that have been thought of in more recent decade or in past decades. I mean, excuse me, as being feminine. So this is also it's about sexuality, it's about gender, it's about all of these things. Now, in the 1990s, queer was not used necessarily as an identity. It was initially being reappropriated from the slur of calling someone that. And it becomes a point of resistance. It's like, fine, you're going to call me queer, I'm going to embrace it, I'm going to own it, and I'm going to turn it into something positive, and I'm going to throw it back at you. So, this was a rejection of the very concept of what is normal. And because you think about what queer actually means, it means something that's odd or different. Well, in that sense, as queer activists and theorists have pointed out, we're all queer because nobody fits the ideal of normal. No one can. It's an ideal. People are not ideals. We're human beings. We also see with millennial generation as well as Gen Z that is coming up now, um, a resistance to labeling at all. Foucault would be very proud. He was very much against labeling and particularly internalizing those labels and totalizing those labels. Those labels define the total of who you are as a human being. No human being is that simple. We're too complex to be pigeonholed like that by labels. And so there's a couple of things going on with the resistance to labels coming from younger generations, though. Older generations, particularly those who fought for gay rights during gay liberation or during the homophile movement, um, look at young people coming up who do not want to identify as gay or lesbian, and they wonder, are you homophobic? Is that what's going on? Are you biphobic? Are you trying to, are you afraid of gay stereotypes being attached to you? Um, but what the younger generation and many queer theorists realize is that this resistance to labeling is about trying to reclaim the complexity of humanity and not try to pigeonhole who people are by these identity labels. And this is a part of what's considered postmodern theory in general. The idea that we have moved beyond the modern moment historically into something that is very different, that is more about multiplicity, that is about the complexity, about things not being set in stone. And so, one of the things that we end up seeing with the politics here is this kind of implosion of meaning. So, an explosion, it blows out, right? Implosion, it collapses in on itself. So, the implosion of identity is where you attach so many different meanings to a particular label. Or use it in ways that do not sync up with historical ways of using it, that the identity itself or the label itself stops meaning anything concrete. And this is a core part of queer theory itself. Now, we also see that many people who would otherwise identify as straight are also embracing the label of queer. And you're seeing more and more people now. And when it first started, remember, queer was not used as an identity. However, some people have begun to use queer as an identity. So if you ask somebody their sexual identity, someone who has studied this stuff, who has spent a lot of time thinking about this, might tell you that they're queer. And that doesn't tell you, though, necessarily who they find attractive or what their sexual desires are or what sexual behaviors they prefer to engage in. It tells you nothing about that because someone um, could prefer only same-sex sexual interactions and identify as queer, and somebody could only want sex from different genders and still identify as queer as well. And so, again, this is a part of this implosion of identity labels. And we see several, now in sociology, we are not about labeling people. But if groups self identify or label, or if groups have been labeled by other groups, we will use the terminology that the groups themselves use. It's kind of a sign of social respect. You're respecting their right to self determine and self identify. And so, for instance, I would never go around and say, "Oh, you are this identity, you are that identity." I have no right to do that. No one has any right to do that to someone else. We may do it, but it doesn't make it right. So you see groups of queer straights who identify themselves as straight sissy boys, elective straight queers, social justice straight queers, and committed straight queers. And so these are ways that straight communities are embracing queer culture and queer movements. We see that there's also this history of understanding gender and sexuality. Um, it used to be either or. You're either this or you're that, and nothing in between. Then in the 20th century, we started thinking in terms of spectrums. Now, spectrums, though, are still two-dimensional, and human beings are not. And so queer theory is much more about multidimensional thinking about people. It's about multiplicity, it's about fluidity, where somebody may identify a certain way in one context and a different way in another context. That doesn't necessarily mean they're being dishonest. It means that they're understanding their identity is fluid according to social context. Um, We see also a raging debate that's been going on for decades now in trans communities in terms of how to use labels, how to use the prefix trans, whether to use it or not. And also terms that many trans activists find very problematic, like bio boys and genetic girls and things along those lines that end up privileging biology over what is actually a social construct, gender. Just real quick, I mean, gender and sex are not the same things. Gender is much more about social performances. Sex is more connected to biology and anatomy and chromosomes and things like that. But even sex becomes problematic in this way. And there's a lot of social construction that goes into that. And to illustrate it, all you need to do is look at the instance of intersex people who, as I mentioned in the last video, are both male and female, or neither male nor female, depending on how you interpret it. All right. Now, we also see this in terms of gender, such as the concept of gender queer, where people are more fluid in their gender performances. Now, institutions, however, try to impose concrete labels and identities. So imagine if you're genderqueer and you come to the question of what's your sex, male or female? What do you mark? Both? Neither? Well, you can't really get a driver's license if you refuse to answer one or the other. And so this binary thinking is still imposed on us through political and social organizations and institutions. What about androgynous people? People whose gender performance is neither clearly masculine nor feminine, or people where people become really uncomfortable, and you'll see someone follow someone who's androgynous just to see which bathroom they go into, for instance. And they have to know because they don't know how to interact with the person if they don't know for certain if they're male or female. Um, Now, this, however, can have very serious consequences for people. Imagine, for instance, and this is not something that I'm just making up, this is something that actually has occurred, that you are gender fluid and your ID, your passport forces you to pick male or female. And typically you have to do that based on what your birth certificate says. And it is very difficult to change your sex on your birth certificate. It can be done, but it is very difficult. So imagine that your birth certificate says that you are female, but your gender expression is very masculine. Well, if you go through TSA and to get on a plane, and in the screening process, they're looking at your passport and it says that you're female, but the TSA agent's looking at you and they see a man. Well, you can be arrested for uh, a false identity. These have very serious consequences. There are instances where somebody is a trans woman who still uh, has penis and testicles and gets into an accident, and the EMTs who in the ambulance pick her up, and then once they discover her genitals, stop working and allow her to die. I mean, so this is not just some theoretical, let's sit and think about these things for a moment. These things have very real life consequences for people. So there we are. I hope everyone is safe and healthy. I'm wishing you all the best. If you need any help whatsoever, feel free to contact me and by email, and I will help you out. Have a good one, class.